In 2023, Pride is canceled. Welcome to Gay Wrath. Hello, Champagne Nightmares. Welcome back to my channel. Or if you're new here, welcome. I don't know how you found me, but I hope you'll hit that subscribe button and stick around. My name is Janessa J. Champagne, and I am North Dakota's trash queen of glam, geek, and gore. And for this video, we're going to do something a little bit different. It's Pride season. I'm going to get this up in June, I swear. I'm not always so good at sticking to a schedule, but for Pride, I wanted to make sure that I had a list of some fabulous Pride-themed or Pride-appropriate horror movies for you to watch. We're queer all year round, so we don't have to just do the spooky at Halloween time. We can do it whenever we want. I thought, let's pull out some fun Pride-appropriate horror movies. So some of these might have a more kind of obvious queer storyline. They may feature queer actors, or maybe they just have a sensibility that's really appropriate for queer people and what they're going through right now. We're going to talk about that. So if you're excited to get into some queer-appropriate horror movies to watch this Pride season, then stick around because we're getting into it right now. Girl, I don't know about you, but I have been put through it this year. So this year, with all of the anti-queer, anti-trans bills that are going on, it's been wild. It has been bananas out here in these streets. It has been a whole lot of awful homophobic, transphobic, queer-phobic fuckery. And so I'm excited to celebrate Pride this year even more than usual. When people ask, oh, why do you need Pride? This is exactly why, because there are still awful, terrible people out there that are trying to make our lives difficult, trying to erase us from this earth. And so we are here to celebrate, to have a good time, and just to remind you that we're not fucking going anywhere. So get over it, bitch. This video is inspired by a very dear friend of mine, Hexorcist. I'm going to make sure to link her information down below so that you can find her. I love Hexorcist. She is a fabulous goth model, just a beautiful person. She's into metal. She's very cool. And I've had the opportunity to model with her a couple times. I've been very lucky that she has allowed this big old voluptuous cake to just pop on down next to her and take some beautiful pictures. So I love Hexorcist. She did a TikTok that was this kind of thing, so I decided to go ahead and steal this from her. So thanks, girl. So I'm excited to tell you about some horror movies that I think would be really great for the Pride season. Now, some of them may feature more explicit kind of queerness in them, but there's also quite a few where queerness is sort of a subtext. There has been this long history of queerness and horror, and you know, the horror is all about the other. Where do we find the other? People will say that there's two types of horror. So if you imagine that back in our prehistory, we're all sitting around the campfire, the tribe is gathered, and the old man is going to tell the story of where evil comes from. And there are two stories. Either evil is out there beyond the bounds of the firelight, or evil is right here. Evil is us. Evil is each other and how we treat each other. So that as a metaphor for queerness and how queer and trans people are treated in society is very much a rich metaphor that is explored in a lot of different movies. So I wanted to give you 10 that I think are the best of the best that you can watch this Pride season. In the number 10 spot, they're all gonna laugh at you! I can see your dirty pillows. Carrie. I love Carrie. I have always loved Carrie. It is my favorite Stephen King book. I absolutely think it's wonderful. If you haven't seen my video on my top Stephen King books, then check it out right here. But I love Carrie. I think that it is great. It's a wonderful story. Well, not a wonderful story. She kills everybody at the prom. But it is sort of part of that genre of horror that I would describe as good for you, girl. Because Carrie is bullied and mistreated by these awful people at her high school. and she gets her revenge. It's this wonderful underdog revenge story. And so it's hard not to feel a little sorry for Carrie. It's hard not to understand. It's hard not to cheer for her when she blows up the prom and really just takes out those awful kids. So I may do a video about both versions of Carrie because I have a lot of videos on my channel where I talk about movies that have been remade. So the original is in 1976 and stars Sissy Spacek as Carrie. It's a classic, it's wonderful, and I think that that one absolutely is perfect for Pride season, but I especially want to call your attention to the 2013 remake featuring Chloe Grace Moretz. I think that she did a fantastic job. Julianne Moore, I mean, she's not Piper Laurie. I still miss the over-the-top, they're all gonna laugh at you. I miss all of the theatrics, but I felt like Julianne Moore was still pretty good. And I think that 2013's Carrie is a little bit truer to the Carrie in the book. Because in the book, Carrie is learning about these powers that she maybe has, and she's kind of experimenting with them. She like lifts the furniture in her room, and it's this whole thing, and you get some of her inner monologue, and she starts to think, I could hurt these people. I have power. I could get back at these people who are mean to me. And she has a little bit more agency. And so in the book, after they dump the pig's blood on her, Carrie leaves the prom, and then she's getting madder and madder and madder, and then she's like, wait, I can do something about this. And she goes back to the prom. So starting the prom on fire is a conscious choice. She makes the decision to go back and get her revenge. Now, in the original with Sissy Spacek, blood gets dumped on her. She just sort of reacts, and it seems like this blind, hysterical reaction. And then by the time she gets home, she's like, oh my God, what did I do? The Carrie in the book is much more purposeful about it. And I felt like the 2013 Carrie with Chloe Grace Moretz gets a little bit more of that tension of she seems to know what she's doing. She seems to be making conscious choices to get revenge rather than just reacting to the enormity of the situations. I love both versions of Carrie. I think you can love two different versions of a work. I don't think you have to choose sides, nerds. So I think that they're both great, and I think that the 2013 could be especially relevant to the Pride that we're experiencing this year. It's time for some vengeance. In the number 9 spot, one of my favorites, which I talked about in an earlier video where I talked about some of my early horror influences. I'll link that video right here for you. But in the number 9 spot, we have Dark Shadows. I love Dark Shadows. It is super campy. It is super fun. It started as kind of a gothic soap opera. So they were doing typical soap opera kind of stuff, but they were doing it in a big Victorian house. And there were lots of shadows and spooky piano music and all kinds of things like that. And it was sort of tanking. And so then at some point they added a ghost, and things picked up, and people were like, oh, what's that about? That's fun. We like the supernatural stuff. And so then it kept going down after the ghost left, and they're like, fuck it, we're gonna get canceled anyway. Let's go wild. And they added a vampire character, and things took off. They added Jonathan Frid, who played Barnabas Collins, in episode 210 or 211 of the show, and it continued on for another 4 years. It was immensely popular. Kids were running home after school. They thought it was so good, and it's so campy and fun because they really were trying to find that balance of the traditional soap opera, lovey-dovey family drama stories and supernatural things like Frankenstein's monster and vampires and werewolves and witches. It was really great. And what I love about this, and why I think it's especially appropriate for Pride, is that I found an article. I'm going to try to link it below, but the article seems to like come and go. Sometimes it's available online, sometimes it's not. I have a hard time finding it sometimes. But it was talking about all of the different actors who appeared on Dark Shadows who were gay. There was a lot of gay men who were on Dark Shadows camping it up. Now, some of them were kind of out during their lifetime. This started in 1966. It ran from 66 to 71. So some of them came out later in life. Some of them it was kind of an open secret. Some of them never came out. There were a lot of the men from Dark Shadows who, unfortunately, in the 80s, we lost them to AIDS. And there was a lot of gay male energy on that set. And I think it's really great to look back and see that there were all of these people who were living in a different time and bringing this sort of energy to this very campy, very cool show. So I think that's a great way to celebrate some of our history, some of our elders, people who lived in a time where you maybe couldn't be as out or couldn't be out at all, especially in the professional sphere. So to find that history out later about this show that I really loved, I think is really cool. Barnabas Collins was absolutely a gay man. Jonathan Frid, he just died a few years ago, but he lived a long life. Roger Collins, Louis Edmonds, and Joel Carruthers, who played Joe, he unfortunately died in the 80s. The guy who played Nicholas Blair. There's so many. I'm going to try to find that article, and I'll maybe put some pictures and some names of characters in here as well. But the article that I found listed, I think, almost 20 gay men who had prominent roles on Dark Shadows. So this is the perfect time to bust out some highlight reels, watch a few random episodes, and just get into the Dark Shadows campy spirit of things. In the number 8 spot, we have a classic. If you love lesbian vampire subtext, we have Dracula's Daughter. Now, obviously, for lesbian vampires, we could talk about The Hunger with Catherine Deneuve and Susan Sarandon. Wonderful, fabulous, but that is a little bit more on the surface. That is a great one. If you're looking for lesbian horror cinema, that's another great option. But I love Dracula's Daughter. It's from that Universal Studios time period. So it's very classic. It's black and white. There's these very dramatic moments, the way people's faces are drawn and the costuming. And it's just really wonderfully done. It's very fun, and there's a really great lesbian subtext to Dracula's Daughter. So Dracula's Daughter is kind of haunted by the curse of Dracula, and she has to feed on blood, but she's sort of tortured by it, and so she wants to be cured, and she seems to be kind of flirting with this doctor, but then she really seems to be flirting even more with his girlfriend, and she finds these women who are, you know, prostitutes or poor women, and she's going to paint them. Girl, if I had a nickel for every time I heard that. And so she, like, brings them into her house and preys on them, and then they're found dead the next day or whatever. And so it's really interesting, and it's really fun how they bring in this very clear lesbian subtext. I think it's a lot of fun. And so lesbians, vampires are very sexy. It's all about the blood and the body and throbbing and pulsing. So vampires are meant to be sexy. So I love that lesbians who aren't always really kind of given that kind of sexy moment, I love that she has that in Dracula's Daughter. In the number 7 spot, they, as in they can't believe that they're recommending this slasher film to you. It's the Peacock slasher They, Them, starring Kevin Bacon. 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon from Friday the 13th, early in his career. Now he is kind of the lead of this very queer-themed slasher film. It's so interesting. I did a video on this film. I'm going to go ahead and link it here. And I really think that there's some interesting kind of politics in here. And I did talk about the fact that in terms of being a straight-up slasher film, it's not the best. It's not great. But in terms of the politics and the way that it presents queerness, I thought it had a really interesting take. And I loved that it wasn't just this excuse to show queer people suffering. In fact, most of the suffering was about if you are homophobic or transphobic, those were the people who suffered. So I really liked that aspect of it. I love that it wasn't just this like torture porn shoot of queer people being attacked and degraded and killed. So I think They, Them is a lot of fun. I think it's a little bit clunky, and there are a couple of moments that maybe are a little bit cheesy, but I loved it. I thought it was a really interesting take on how gender and sexuality have played into horror, and how gender and sexuality are still being talked about today, and how there are people who are against queer and trans and non-binary people who don't even necessarily understand what they're talking about. So they don't understand the differences between gender and sexual orientation. They don't understand that those are not the same thing. Now, they are separate, but they also kind of live in the same zip code, right? And there's ways that they weave together, but they're not the same thing. And I think that this movie really brings out some of those distinctions of sometimes people who are mad about queer folks that don't even know what they're mad at. So I really liked They, Them. I thought it was pretty well done. The slasher aspect of it wasn't as good, but there are a couple of fun kills in that, and there's a really interesting kind of subtext to it in terms of queerness. And there's also this message in the film about not letting your experience of trauma and people being hateful and awful to you, not letting that make you bitter. And I think that that's really important. That's one of the things that you're going to see throughout this list is that homophobia and transphobia, all of that stuff that queer and trans and non-binary people experience is a form of trauma. And so again, as horror films have become a little bit more sophisticated and are more willing to talk about trauma and those kinds of traumatic experiences, there's even more of a metaphorical connection to queerness and these horror films. And speaking of trauma and mental illness and the role that it plays in our lives and how it's represented in horror, in the number 6 spot, I am Babadook. We've got the Babadook. So somehow the Babadook became this like queer icon. People started memeing the Babadook into gay pride memes and different things. And I think it's great because the Babadook really is about mental illness and depression. And I think that it really is a great metaphor for what queer and trans people experience when they don't have places of safety, when they are being attacked, when they are being pursued, whether that is within their own families and not being supported by the people around them and having to go out into their communities and hopefully find support there, or whether that's just the slew of these awful anti-queer and anti-trans bills that are going through all of these different states. North Dakota has more than its fair share. And so I think the Babadook is really an interesting way of exploring that. And I think the way that that develops and the spookiness of it and the way that it's always kind of there and lingering, it really is a great presentation of what it's like to experience that sort of lingering depression when you have all of this pressure and all of this anxiety about your identity and how you fit into the world and whether or not you have safety. I mean, that's the relationship between the mother and the son. It's all about, am I safe at home? And I think that that's a great metaphor for a lot of queer and trans people. Now, a lot of these have been very metaphorical. For the number 5 spot, I decided to just go full on gay. In the number 5 spot, we have Death Drop Gorgeous, and that is a fabulous queer-themed slasher starring a bunch of really fun drag queens, and it's all about drag culture and how youth is really prized, almost worshipped within gay culture. And it's a fun slasher film. It's got a lot of really campy, fun performances. It's got some really well done death scenes. I was very excited that I was able to give Death Drop Gorgeous its North Dakota premiere. We showed it at a Miss J's Friday Night Frights, and it's just a lot of fun. Don't go looking for any deep meaning in this one. There is a little bit there. There definitely is some stuff about how gay culture really eroticizes and worships at the altar of youth, but it's also just a really fun, campy slasher. And it's made by queer folks. The directors are queer. Most of the actors are all queer, if not all of them. And so it really is a great queer-produced, made by queer people for queer people. So it's the perfect, campy, fun horror slasher film to celebrate Pride with. Now, not to get controversial at the gig, in the number 4 spot, we have one of my favorites, Sleepaway Camp. Hold on. I know you've heard, everybody says that Sleepaway Camp is transphobic. And I think that that's not really accurate. And I'm not trying to invalidate anybody's voice or whatever. I'm not saying that people can't see it and be offended by it. But I think that when we're talking about things being transphobic, I think that there are certain ways that you could take a perspective and interpret some of what happens in Sleepaway Camp as transphobic. But just because something is subjectively transphobic, that doesn't mean that it's objectively transphobic. It's more about the interpretation. Now, I say that because if you look at the sequels to Sleepaway Camp, especially 2 and 3, those absolutely are objectively transphobic. There's stuff that they built into those films. There are jokes and just different references that are clearly transphobic. They're not very well done. And I don't think that it was malicious. I think that what they were trying to do was make sequels to this film that had this very specific, hard to follow kind of ending of once you know the secret of Angela Baker, what do you do with that, right? Like, how do you take that and then turn it into a continuing narrative? Because the whole point of this is that it was this hidden secret. At the end of the film, the secret is out. And so then they tried to just tag on this information to, like, explain away how Angela is still around and how we should refer to her. And they didn't do very well. It was not sensitive to trans people. It was a little bit offensive, and so I absolutely can see that. But in terms of the original Sleepaway Camp, I think it's much different. I think it's much more about bullying and queerness, and there are some real undercurrents that I think really deserve some attention. One of the arguments that I've heard is that it's transphobic because audience members won't know the difference between Angela and an actual trans person. Now, I think that once you get into the realm of assuming what your audience does or doesn't know, that's where we get into what I was talking about, things being sort of subjectively transphobic. So I'm not saying that an individual trans person couldn't see this and be offended and say, hey, that doesn't seem right. But I don't think that just because you're assuming that the audience is going to misunderstand what's being presented, that makes something objectively transphobic. So once you take away that film of assuming that this is transphobic, there's actually really interesting stuff about sexuality in this film. The big secret, the movie's going to be 40 this year, so if you haven't seen it by now, I can't help it. Spoilers. Obviously, there's spoilers throughout here. If you have not seen it by now, get with the program. Angela, who is actually Peter, there's this accident at the beginning where we see these 2 little kids, and there's a boating accident, and one of the little kids is dead. And we're not explicitly told whether it's the boy or the girl, but then we flash to a few years later, and Angela is getting ready to go to camp with her cousin Ricky. And so we assume, oh, the little girl lived. And at the end, we find out it was actually the little boy. And because of Aunt Martha, who's a very strange figure that I'm still trying to figure out, she forced Peter to live as Angela. It's this whole thing. But so what I find interesting is throughout the movie, whenever anybody brings Angela's body into focus, or anybody who teases her about getting dressed where people can't see her and all these different things, whenever she's made to confront the reality of her body, that's when she lashes out and kills somebody. And so there's this real kind of interesting idea about what does she feel about her body? And how do we even refer to her? Because again, she's played by Felissa Rose, and it's very easy to call her she and to call her Angela because that feels real. But at the end we find out it's not real. And it's a very strange kind of perspective. I'm planning a whole video and maybe even a couple of videos for the 40th anniversary this year. It turns 40 in November, but I'm going to explore that more in a later video. But I think it's really interesting that there's this queer subtext, even without considering the Peter-Angela connection, because another flashback also shows us that Peter and Angela, the 2 little kids, were being raised by a same-sex couple. And there's no explanation for it. There's no real kind of context for it other than a couple of flashbacks where we see the 2 men at the beginning where one of the kids dies in the boating accident, and then we see a flashback where Peter and Angela are watching the 2 men in bed together. And if you take it outside of the context of it happening in the middle of a slasher film, it's actually a very loving, sweet scene. So it's hard to pin down what they were trying to say about queerness or same-sex attraction. And I think that Angela, Peter, this kind of mystery around who Angela really is not so much about gender identity, and it's much more about sexuality. So if you want to know more about that, be on the lookout for that video. But for now, you can do the pre-work and check out Sleepaway Camp. Why don't gay men make good boxers? It's alright, I can tell that joke. I have a friend who's gay. In the number 3 spot, we have the 1980 film Cruising. So Cruising was very controversial when it came out, and it's one of those films that, you know, probably isn't perfect, but it's been rediscovered and it's been reinterpreted, and once you look at it through a queer lens, it's got some interesting stuff to look at. I have always been the person who says, I don't think we need to just hide things away and try to pretend that they didn't happen. I think it's important to look at these early texts so we can see the development of queer representation in general cinema, in horror cinema, in all these different places, and Cruising is a really important part of that. And of course, it's this story. Al Pacino is a cop who goes undercover in the gay leather scene, and there's a fisting scene, hence the joke. And I've also shown Cruising at a Miss J's Friday Night Frights. Sometimes it's better to just ask forgiveness than permission. I don't know if Grand Forks was ready, but they had to be ready.
Was that one your mom went to?
Yeah. Yeah. So Cruising is this really interesting exploration of this subculture, and it's not particularly accurate. It's not something that's like, let's give you a documentary perspective on gay male leather culture, but it is an interesting way of using that community and some of the norms of that community as a way to explore the boundaries and the edges of queerness, and I thought it was really interesting. Now, a lot of Cruising was actually reinterpreted the most recent season of American Horror Story, which I thought was great. And now there were some people that I know that are a little bit younger, we'll talk about that, who were really upset about that season of American Horror Story, and they thought that it was really inappropriate to use leather and BDSM and AIDS as this kind of horror story. And I think that while young people mean well, I also think that a lot of the young Gen Z people just do not understand how impactful AIDS was on the gay community and queers in general. I don't think they really get how it really was a horror story. People who were living during that time, it really was so pervasive, and the government wasn't doing anything to help. Ronald Reagan was 7 years into his presidential terms before he even said the word AIDS in a public address, 1987. So people just kind of let the gay community on its own to die. And so I think people don't necessarily understand how much of a horror show it really was. When I came out, it was the mid to late 90s, and so we were kind of coming out of that. There were starting to be some treatments for HIV and AIDS, and there still wasn't any sort of PrEP or anything like that, but it was a little bit easier to manage. It was a little bit less of a death sentence to get it. But in the 80s, during that time of Cruising and the time that American Horror Story set that season, that was kind of the reality, you know, when Sandra Bernhard is doing the tarot reading and she keeps pulling the death card and every card turns into the death card. That was kind of accurate to a lot of what happened during that time. I think it's important to remember and to revere our history, even if it's uncomfortable. And so I think, again, to just dismiss it and say, oh, it's not being very nice to leather people or whatever. And it's like, leather is not the problem. If you see American Horror Story that season and you think leather is the problem, then you're missing the whole point. It's really about how queer people fit into society at that time and the way they were treated by the police brutality, police ignoring murders within the gay community and death within the gay community, the way that hospital workers shunned queer and trans people. It's really about that history and about that collective story of suffering and of horror. So I think that Cruising, that's what I would say for number 3. In the number 2 spot, the gayest horror movie of all time, according to The Village Voice, Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddys Revenge. This was a great movie, and it was really panned at the time because of all of the gay subtext. But this is one of the few slasher movies that has a final boy. There is kind of a final girl, Kim, his, like, sort of girlfriend, but all of it really focuses on Mark Patton's character, Jesse Walsh. Now, there is a documentary about Mark Patton and about his experience playing that role in Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I talk about it in this video here about horror documentaries. Scream Queen! But really what they were trying to do is the writer was trying to use this sort of gay subtext to tell a story. And so really you get Jesse confronting the fact that there's something inside him. And that becomes this metaphor of potentially somebody who is wrestling with their sexuality. In some cases, the subtext is just text. Like, it's not even that subtle. So Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is a lot of fun. So when you go back to it with a more modern sensibility, at the time it really did feel kind of homophobic. But now we can look back at it and we can kind of appreciate it. And it brings in queer desire. I mean, the coach is kind of this weird S&M leather kind of guy, and there's a weird maybe attraction with him and Jesse. Jesse is clearly attracted to his best friend who appears shirtless, and it's all about wrestling with this desire and this demon inside. And so I think you should check out Nightmare on Elm Street 2. If you go and read reviews, it gets panned, but I think it's been rediscovered. There's much more of a queer sensibility to how you can read that film and interpret it, and I think it's worthwhile looking at during this Pride season. And in the number one spot, I think we have to give it to Smile. I loved Smile. I think that Smile is really great. Smile is not the kind of horror that I usually enjoy, so it's very much in that vein of The Conjuring and those kinds of things where it's a lot of jump scares, it's a lot of quick camera turns and things jumping out at the shadows. That feels like a cheap kind of horror to me. I don't like it. And that's what Smile is. But the story is so good that I love it. Against my better judgment, I just love it. And what Smile is all about is about trauma. It's about having to face and handle your trauma. And I think that right now, we need those kinds of narratives to remind us that it's okay to seek help. Right now, things are very traumatic for queer and trans and non-binary people. The attacks that are happening in these state legislatures, the things that are happening in culture, all this Bud Light, Target bullshit that's happening. I mean, people are finally starting to see behind the rainbow washing. You know, Target always trying to be, we're super gay, like, hi gay. And then the minute they start getting any sort of pushback, they're like, oh, shove it to the back of the store, or let's get rid of these things and let's get rid of this. And the person who did the artwork, I'll have to put their name up on the screen, who did some of their merchandise and was a queer artist and has done some like Satan-themed artwork in the past. Just cutesy little drawings of like a goat-headed demon that says Satan respects pronouns and just cutesy stuff like that. People got all upset that this satanic artist was being pushed by Target, and Target pulled the merch and has not offered any support. As of this filming, I've been researching, and the artist has gone and done interviews and said Target has done nothing. They haven't responded. They didn't even tell me they were pulling the merch. They just it just came out of nowhere. And so now I am getting threats and I'm getting attacked. And so Target, who's claiming to be an ally, where are they? What are you doing? And that's what I want to know. And that's why I think that we really need to address. I'm fine with rainbow products. I get that businesses are there to sell products. So if you're going to make some rainbow products for Pride, that's fine. If you're going to claim to be an ally, be an ally. And that doesn't mean just slapping some rainbows on shit so you can make money. You know, right before this big hubbub with Target, their CEO was on some interview show and was like, diversity is core to our brand, and this is so important, and we have to do this. And then when push came to shove, they just walked away, and it was absolutely shameful. There's a lot of trauma in the queer community and the trans community and the non-binary community right now, and Smile is all about the fact that if you don't heal your trauma, if you don't address it, it will destroy you. And I think that when we look at the suicide statistics for queer and trans and non-binary people, we can see that that is absolutely true. So I think that Smile is, not only is it just a great horror movie, it's really well done, it's really scary, and it has a really good kind of underlying message. I think it's a good reminder during this Pride season that we have a lot of trauma and we deserve to have that taken seriously and to be able to find resources to be able to cope with it and to heal. That is it. That is it for the video. I know there's lots of other, especially more explicitly queer horror films. If you have any recommendations, put them down in the comments below. This was just my feeling. I just was sitting up and I was like, let's come up with what are the films that we would do. I know there's so many other things I could have included, so many like very queer, very campy kinds of things, but this was just the list that came up to me, especially considering the experience of Pride that we're having this year with everything that's going on in the world. If you have any other suggestions, leave them down in the comments below, and maybe we'll do a sequel video. Who knows? While you're down there, don't forget to give me that thumbs up to tell me that you appreciated this video. Or if you are just salty because your favorite queer horror film didn't make it on the list, if you are just like, girl, we are so sick of you talking about fucking Sleepaway Camp, get over it, then give me that thumbs down. I will take it. It's all engagement. The algorithm isn't a picky bitch, and neither am I. And while you're down there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of all future uploads. I try my hardest to make sure I get at least one video a week. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you might even get a bonus video. Ooh, Sleepaway Camperific. If you'd like to chat, banter, or commiserate between uploads, all of my social media will be linked down in the description box below, including a link to my website, The World of Champagne at JanessaJ.com. Thanks so much for watching. I love and appreciate all of you. I hope you're having a great Pride season. For me, Pride is over. I'm ready for gay wrath. That's my feeling for this year. I'm ready to fuck it up. But also, we need to celebrate. We need to make sure that what wins we have, what progress we made, we celebrate it. Emma Goldman said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. And you know what? As much as all of this stuff, we have to keep fighting, we have to keep working, we also need to remember that queer and trans joy is just as important. So I hope you got a little bit of joy out of this video, and until I see you again, bye. Now in the... So when the blood jumps on her... Jumps on her? Jumps on her. To Dracula's daughter. To Dracula's daughter, not Dracula's daughter.
Dracula's daughter.
There's even more of a metaphysical. Now, when they first started putting that together, the alphabet soup was a little bit shorter, and people used to say GLBT, and at some point they switched to LGBT. And part of the reason for that switch was to recognize the fact that lesbians really stepped up during the AIDS crisis, and there were hospital workers who would refuse to work with AIDS patients. And the lesbians in the community came together and would support and would go in and do all of this volunteering and help at hospitals and bring meals and just sit with people who are dying whose families abandoned them. The Babadook. I am Babashook. Babadook. I should say the Babadook, because then I can say Babashook. Okay.